Today, in a special crossover edition of Locked On Canadiens and Locked On Red Wings, we get to learn about each other's teams and decide which team is actually going to make the playoffs first.
You're Locked On Canadiens, your daily podcast on the Montreal Canadiens, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hi there, everyone, and welcome to a special crossover edition of Locked On Canadiens and Locked On Red Wings. We're going to learn about each other's teams, and we are going to decide which of these teams is going to make the playoffs first. First, we want to thank you all for making us your first listen of the day every day, whether you're in Montreal or Detroit or one of the many fans all over. As you know, we're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where you get your team every single day. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Place your first $5 bet and you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. My name is Laura Saba, one of the hosts of Locked On Canadiens, and I'm joined not by the wonderful Ian Boisvert, but the equally wonderful Brian Fisher of Locked On Red Wings. Brian, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. I'm excited because hockey is inching ever so closer. We got training camp going on right now. By the time this airs on my end, it's probably going to be in the midst of preseason. Hockey is just, it's here. RFAs are signed. It's a great time to be a Red Wings fan because right now, before the season started, expectations are high, hype is high. Nothing can ruin the vibes quite yet.
Although I will say, I watched the Red Wings fans with envy last year because they played meaningful games until the very last game of the season. We are going to talk a little bit about that. And the way it's going to work today is first I'm going to grill Brian about the Detroit Red Wings, and then he's going to learn a little bit about the Montreal Canadiens. And then in our last segment, we're going to go around the Atlantic Division and talk about why we hate every other team, because that's what we're here for. And I'm on the record. My previous co-host and I are on the record when it was getting closer to the playoffs. We all wanted Detroit to make it, even though the last two games were against the Montreal Canadiens. We're like, we want Detroit to have this because they're the team we hate the least in the Atlantic Division. Not sure if that's how you guys feel, but tell me a little bit about what offseason moves were made that were most impactful for the Red Wings. And, they were oh so close. Like, what do you think that they'll be able to push it over the edge this time and actually get a playoff spot?
Ooh, that's a lot of loaded questions to answer. So first and foremost, I think the most obvious offseason addition that they made was Vladimir Tarasenko. He's not the 40-goal scorer that he used to be, but he can still really grip it and rip it. And I think the underrated thing that people don't realize about him, or they may realize about him, but like when people think Tarasenko, they think former 40-goal scorer, absolute snipe show. He is going to bring a level of forecheck that this Red Wings team did not have last season. Their forecheck was not great. Tarasenko is going to be hard on the puck. He's going to chase guys down, force turnovers, and I think that's a huge addition to the top six, especially considering that they lost a lot of offense in the offseason as well with Daniel Sprong, David Perron, Shane Gostisbehere, guys of that caliber all walking away. They needed to sign somebody to help replace that offense, and that was what Vladimir Tarasenko did. He'll likely, in all of our estimations, and we even saw it on training camp day one, play opposite of Patrik Laine, who's one of the best playmakers in NHL history. So the idea of Kane opposite of Tarasenko could be a lethal combo, and that makes this top six legitimately dangerous. A little old on that second line, but Kane proved last year, coming off of a surgery that nobody's ever come back from in an impactful way, that he can still be the Patrik Laine that we all know and that we all feared across the league up until, he's on the Red Wings now. In 40 games he played last year. So now with a full offseason of training, it's a little bit even more like anticipation to see what Patrik Laine can do. And, he's kind of, I know it's not necessarily a offseason acquisition because he was on the team last year, but I would put him in that category because he went up to the day before free agency. I had come to terms with the fact that he was probably leaving because he proved last year he still had it in him. So getting Patrik Laine, getting Vladimir Tarasenko, those are two huge additions that really help round out that top six and take the pressure off that top line in particular. Of providing all the goal scoring. So that was huge for the Red Wings. And then, again, not necessarily acquisitions, but locking up Raymond and Seider long term, which, I mean, when we spoke last week, Laura, on a roundtable, which will come out later, closer to the start of the season. Those two weren't signed yet, and now they both are. We know what that number is. They're very reasonable numbers. I would argue almost good numbers considering where they're at in their careers and what they could have left to do. I mean, that's two pieces of your core that are now locked up. The Red Wings have a bona fide core now, and that's really exciting to see. So as far as making the playoffs go, I mean, we're going to talk about it in segment 3. I don't know this, and that's not what Red Wings fans want to hear. I understand that. But I can't come on here and just be unbiased or be biased Red Wings fan and be like, this is our year. This Atlantic Division is difficult. The wild card situation with the Metropolitan is difficult. Like, they're going to have to improve upon last year, and they already took an 11-point leap last year to get to 91 points. So the things they got to do to improve are things that Derek Lalonde has mentioned during training camp, which is getting better defensively. So they lost goals. Last year, they were a top 10 team in goals scored, but they were a top 10 team in goals against as well. So if they want to make the playoffs, they're going to have to get better defensively. Tarasenko helps replace some of those goals lost, but really it's going to come down to playing smarter defensive hockey, focusing on those breakouts, because they were abysmal on the breakouts, because the forwards last year were no good at helping in the defensive zone. And just really, really, really focusing on keeping pucks out of your own net. And then I think they could crack it. It's going to be really close, though, because you got Ottawa pushing, you got Buffalo pushing. The top 4 of this division are still all right there. Like the expectation should be to make the playoffs. It should be. This is going to be 2020 season, 21, 22, 23, 24. Now this is 25. So this will be the 6th season of Steve Yzerman. We need to see results. Right. We need to see results. And the expectation should be to make playoffs. I just don't know if they will, because so many teams in this division are on the cusp.
Yeah, and that's kind of the thing that we were talking about, I think, in the roundtable. We didn't say it in so many words, but, the Montreal Canadiens could realistically get 10 to 15 more points than they did last year overall and still be the last in the division because of everyone else that's in it. It's a really, really tough division. It's exciting, though, because there's so much more hockey that they have to kind of improve upon. But Lalonde kind of hit a little bit on my next question, which was, tell me a little bit about the defensive structure of the Detroit Red Wings. Like, I do, looking at the numbers, I wasn't watching every night. Looking at the numbers, it does feel like an area that they do need to improve in. It has obviously been acknowledged by the organization. So what do we think, have they done anything to shore it up in the offseason? Have they worked on anything new? Is there something where do you think it's more of a coaching or skills issue? What's going on there?
It's a little bit of all of that, honestly. So their defensive core isn't the best in the world. Obviously, having Moritz Seider as a bona fide two-way defenseman who gets the toughest deployments in the NHL, but still capable of putting up 40-plus points a season is really good. That's one defenseman. You have Ben Chiarot playing with him, probably who you're familiar with, probably on the top pair. And I've softened up on Ben Chiarot over the last 2 years since they signed him. I don't think he's a top pair defenseman, though. I think he's an effective second pair defenseman, but I don't think he's a top pair defenseman. So you have a hole on the left side of the top pair. On the second pair, this is where you get your biggest addition. We saw him for 16 games at the end of last season, but Simon Edvinsson. He was taken 6th overall a couple years. I think 2021 was the year he was drafted. He'll play a full NHL season this year. They're singing his praises at camp. He looked good with playing 16 games down the stretch last season. But then his partner is going to be Jeff Petrie, another player you are familiar with. And Petrie in his prime was a good defenseman.
Yeah.
But I don't know. Here's the thing. Two things can be true at the same time. I think Jeff Petrie is the best option right now on the second pair right side, but that doesn't mean that that's a good thing, right? I think at this point in his career, he's better served on the third pair, but they don't have any better options on the right side for that second pair, and that's the biggest hole on this team, in my opinion, is second pair right side D. Your options are going to be him, Gustafsson, who is a left-handed defenseman and played pretty sheltered minutes last year at the New York Rangers, probably be a third pair. Justin Holl, who played all of 38 games last year for the Detroit Red Wings after getting paid $3 million for 3 years. And then you have rookie Albert Johansson, who has some experience on his offside, but not a guy I expect to leap into a top 4 role. So it's really that second pair that really makes me nervous, and it'll be better, right? Because Simon Edmonds is up here for the full year now, so that it'll be better because of that. It's just the right side that makes me nervous. As far as the rest of the D goes, Olli Mata's here. We know what Olli Mata is. He's going to be a good, sheltered defensive defenseman. Gustafsson is the new addition that they signed. He played with the New York Rangers last year at, I think, 38 points. He'll be a probably power play 1 or power play 2 quarterback. Play sheltered minutes as well because he's more offensive oriented, better defensively than Shane Gostisbehere by a smidge. But I think that Gustafsson was brought in to help replace offense. I really think that is. I don't know how they're going to play Justin Holl. I want to see Albert Johansson kind of push his way into the lineup for an everyday role because I like him a lot. But I don't know. There's 8 defensemen signed on this team right now. Like, I don't know what the heck's going on. And then the forwards need to be better. The forwards need to be better defensively too, which is why they made some of the signings they did, like getting Tyler Mott, who throughout his career has been like penalty kill specialist on the forward group, a defensively responsible forward. So getting better defensively all around the ice is what Lalonde preaches, and that's what this team needs.
I think, we're going to see a lot of, I think, hiccups and stuff on both of our teams. But hopefully for you guys, the outcome at the end of the season is a little bit better than last year's. And in our next segment, what we're going to do is we're going to kind of switch around, and Brian's going to ask me a bunch of questions about the Montreal Canadiens and our expectations. And that's coming up in just one moment. This episode is brought to you by PrizePicks. PrizePicks is America's #1 daily fantasy sports app with over 5 million active members. PrizePicks is the easiest and most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. All you do is pick more or less on 2 to 6 player stat projections and watch the winnings roll in. PrizePicks puts their members first, so all withdrawals are fast, safe, and secure. When my picks hit, I can get my money in as quick as 15 minutes. PrizePicks invented the flex play, which means you can still cash out if your lineup isn't perfect. You can double your money even if one of your picks doesn't hit. And it's so fun and simple to use. Like, playing the game is honestly, it's a no-brainer. Like I said, it's so fun and it's so simple. Download the PrizePicks app today and use code LOCKEDONNHL and get $50 instantly when you play $5. That's code LOCKEDONNHL on PrizePicks to get $50 instantly when you play $5. You don't even need to win to receive the $50 bonus. It is guaranteed. PrizePicks, run your game. When it comes to hiring, the best way to search for a candidate isn't to search at all. Don't search, match with Indeed. If you need to hire, you need Indeed. Indeed is your matching and hiring platform with over 350 million global monthly visitors, according to Indeed data, and a matching engine that helps you find quality candidates fast. Ditch the busy work and use Indeed for scheduling, screening, and messaging so you can connect with candidates faster. One of the things I love about Indeed is that it makes hiring all in one place so easy because it brings everything together. It shows you the best quality matches and it delivers really, truly high quality candidates for your job. And listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit to get your jobs more visibility at Indeed.com/lockedon. Just go to Indeed.com/lockedon right now and support our show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. Indeed.com/lockedon. Terms and conditions apply. Need to hire? You need Indeed. Before we get into it, though, reminder that you should check out Locked On NHL for your second listen of the day. They've got all the storylines. They've got a bunch of hosts from around the network. It's a fun time. Definitely check it out. All right. Your turn, Brian.
Yeah, I mean, my first question is, this is a kid that I've seen all over social media the last few days. Second round pick, Lane Hutson. Mm-hmm. Even at the end of last season, I feel like Canadiens Twitter was going nuts for this kid. And then he drops this beautiful sauce pass on a dime at the Canadiens training camp, and everyone's going nuts. Yeah. What are the expectations with this kid? Do you expect him to make the team? How big of an impact should he have this season?
So that's really, really interesting because you got to see 100% of his NHL experience last year. All games that he played were those last two. Lane Hutson, the expectations are sky high. And as much as Canadiens fans, we try to tell people, manage our expectations. I think like that ship has sailed, that train's out of the station. We cannot manage our expectations with respect to this kid. So the first thing that I'm going to say is, yes, he's expected to make the team this year. I don't know if he'll make it out of camp or if he'll make it shortly thereafter. I do think it's worth it playing him in the first couple of seasons. I think that he's the closest one, but there's one open spot right now on the defense, one sure open spot, and there's 4 defensemen knocking on that door, and Lane Hutson is only one of them, right? You've got Logan Mailloux, who spent all of last year in the AHL, save for a game. You've got Adam Engstrom, who like nobody expected anything out of, and now all of a sudden he's almost there and he's ready. And I think those are the biggest challengers with respect. And then we don't know where Justin Barron's going to play. Justin Barron's kind of an unknown quantity because he shows like some games he can put together consistency in a few games, and then he loses it. He's kind of all over the place, and then he's losing time to prove that the potential that we see is actually his consistent potential and not just flashes in the pan or, sporadic bursts of proper defense. So like, that's one thing, is that there's a huge question mark with respect to which prospect makes that spot vacated by Jordan Harris. But then there's also the fact that we don't really know, you were talking about like second pair, first pair. We don't really know anything because we've got these defensemen and the Canadiens haven't really figured out exactly what their defensive identity is going to be. We are missing, like the one thing we're missing is that bona fide number 1 defenseman, right? We've got a bunch of guys that can be your number 2. We've got a bunch of great players, but there's nobody there that's your like, no questions asked. That person is your number 1 defenseman. With Lane Hutson, he's extremely creative. He's extremely offensive. He's extremely talented. But I would not necessarily at this point in time say that you could consider him a two-way defenseman. Like, he's the guy who's going to be leading the rushes. He's the guy who's going to be getting the puck out of the zone and up the ice. But I don't know very much about how much we can expect his defensive responsibilities to develop. And there's also a big issue with his skating. Like his like the finer points of his skating are great, but the fundamental fact, like moving up the ice, that's really hard for him. Like that explosive speed is not there. So it is something that he's going to have to either compensate for, which people say that he compensates now with his fake outs and his creativity, his ability to like kind of, break people's ankles on the ice. Like, I don't necessarily know how much the Canadiens have invested in his skating. He was in the NCAA, obviously, so he couldn't really take advantage of that much time with the Canadiens after he was drafted in the off seasons, etc. So I'm wondering like what they're going to do to kind of work on that, because it is definitely one of the big weaknesses in his game. And if he could figure that out, I think that the lack of defensive responsibility wouldn't be too bad, because you could just play him with a guy that can complement that, like a David Reinbacher type. We were talking about how in the 2 rookie games they played against the Toronto Maple Leafs, he was paired with Logan Mailloux. And I think, that was kind of twofold. It's kind of to make Logan Mailloux smarter, but also like having somebody there who like can play defensive hockey, right? And I thought that was really interesting, because that's not what Logan Mailloux is known for, but in those games that's really the role he took on. So I feel like Lane Hutson's the kind of guy who also makes the people around you better. And so, there's that aspect of it as well. But I do expect him to be on the team. I expect him to be exciting, but I think we also just need to manage our expectations, because he's going to be playing against a lot of NHL competition. And some of these guys, we like to call, Jay Foster, and like we said, like, the type of hockey players who can read. Like some of the guys that Lane Hutson's going to be playing against are guys who can read.
Right. So that brings me to another guy who is a big acquisition by the Montreal Canadiens, who I'm sure you're sick of talking about at this point, because it's probably dominated your news cycle. You guys acquired Patrik Laine, which was honestly kind of a surprise for, I think, a lot of people, because, Laine being the type of goal scorer that he is and playmaker that he is, I think a lot of people expected him to go to a contender. And instead he went to the Canadiens, who are a team that is trying to build up and build out its core. One, I want to know, what were you surprised when you saw that news break that he came to the Canadiens? And 2, when you're talking about managing expectations, what are your expectations for Patrik Laine as a member of the Canadiens?
So I think, yes, it was an absolute surprise for the exact reason that you said, is that, people expected him to want to go to a contender. There were two reasons why he came to Montreal. One was because Montreal was the only team that did not request that Columbus keep salary, or retain salary. And then the other one was that he wanted to play in a market like this. And so the Canadiens did do their due diligence. They talked to medical experts. They talked to people around him. They talked to the team. They talked, obviously Pascal Einstein is now in Laval. He's part of the organization. So they did their due diligence. They did a lot of research. And I think for me, the expectations are not as high as Patrik Laine's own expectations for himself. He does believe that he can be a 40-goal scorer again. But as Kent Hughes said in his press conference after the acquisition, he said, whether it's 20 goals or 40 goals isn't relevant. Like, the idea is to make the team better, right? And he talked about this being a reward for his players for working so hard, which is true. Like you saw, they still picked fifth overall last year. They didn't really make that much progress with respect to the end of year standings and the end of year point totals. But at the end of the day, each person on this team developed a new aspect of their game or improved a particular skill that they had. Like Martin St. Louis is all about just like those little incremental improvements. And so watching his players work so hard, giving them that reward, I think what Kent Hughes is saying is that we're not going to be out of the game by November or December. We're going to be playing meaningful games into February and March this year, right? Again, we're going to talk a little bit later in our third segment about expectations for this team. But for me, I think if Patrik Laine gets paired with somebody like Kirby Dach, because people don't consider Kirby Dach an acquisition, but it is an addition to this team, right? He was out for almost entire last season. So him coming back in itself is an addition to this team. Them playing together, I feel like, Patrik Laine doesn't get enough credit for his playmaking because he's known for being a goal scorer. But I think Kirby Dach is a type of player that creates space for those guys, that creates those opportunities for those guys. And I feel like, that unspoken language of creativity, of offensive talent is going to play out really well on the ice. Like, I think they're going to be able to help each other out and communicate and kind of, everybody's kind of penciled Patrik Laine on the second line to start. We don't know, Slavkovsky's great on that top line, so we don't want to mess with a good thing, but also Slavkovsky played really well with Kirby Dach in those few games that they were able to play together. So it's a whole kind of, we're trying to temper our expectations, but our expectations are still pretty high for Laine. I like if he hits, if he's able to play 82 games, then for me, it'd be about 30 goals that I'm expecting from him because he's going to be playing with a healthy Kirby Dach, knocking on wood.
Absolutely. I do want to ask you, you kind of hinted at it there about your expectations for this team, but do you want to wait until after we go to a quick break here for me to ask that question?
Yes, and let's do just that. This episode is brought to you by FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. You've heard us talk about FanDuel so many times on this show because it truly is the #1 sportsbook. It is honestly so fun and so easy to use. And NFL fans, you can start the season with a big return on FanDuel. When you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. You'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. That's $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. You heard me right. That's FanDuel.com. All right, let's talk about the rest of the division because, man, I look at that division and my heart sinks every single time.
I mean, does your expectation for your Canadiens, before we get to the rest of that division, I mean, I think everyone, and it's not a shot, right? You guys are, your rebuild's going incredibly well. I want to note that, it's going incredibly well, and it's going pretty fast, it feels like, considering, you went from Cup final, bottom of the division, to already being, in an 80-point situation conversation. Yeah. But, is the expectation to leapfrog any of these teams? Or are you still, looking for an improvement but expect to finish last?
So it's really interesting because the Canadians themselves, right? The players are all like, yeah, we can do it. We can make the playoffs. They're all excited. They're all gung ho. And I think that's the way it should be. Their aim should be to make the playoffs, whether they miss it or not. The organization is a little bit more conservative, right? I had initially predicted that they were going to set the expectation for their team to make the playoffs, but they're not rushing them. They're not putting that kind of pressure on them. Somebody said a really bold prediction would be that they didn't come in last in the division, and that hurt my feelings a lot, but it's understandable because there's so many other good teams. I do think that there's a possibility, right? Like, because it is a very tough division, but it's a possibility that they won't come in last this year.
Yeah, and that's the thing too, right? I harken back to what I was saying about my own Red Wings back in segment 1. Like, the expectation should be to make the playoffs, but I can't fully say with the matter of a fact that they will, because 6 other teams in this division are all eyeing the playoffs as well, looking to either break a playoff drought or keep prying that window open for as long as they can, looking at you, Lightning in Boston. Yeah. But it's just, like, I mean, let's start with that, right? Like, go top of the division. Like, the Florida Panthers, you know, they have kind of adopted that bully puck mentality that Boston was very well known for so long. Makes them really easy to hate. But man, when you look at them, like, you got to respect the way that team is built, because the way I see it and the way I talked to Scotty with it, Laura, they played playoff hockey every single game of the season. Yeah. And I mentioned it, like, they are not afraid to take penalties because they understand that in the NHL, and they have a lot of high-skilled players. Like, I don't want to make it seem like they only take penalties, but in the NHL, referees are only going to call so many penalties against you in fear of looking biased. They're more about managing the game than calling the penalties. So they're not afraid of taking 1,000 minors because they know eventually refs are just going to stop calling a bunch of them. And that's what I mean when I say they play bully puck. Like, they are just going to keep pounding you after the whistle. Draw, like, things that should get called, but they're not going to get called because the refs are going to see it and be like, well, I just called the last 3 on Florida, so I got to let it slide. And they're really good at that. And you combine that with their skill, like, they're a really easy team to hate, but also really easy to understand why they're the top of the division right now.
Absolutely. And that was the thing, like, when we were looking at, you know, the playoff predictions and even the Stanley Cup final predictions, right? Everyone here was talking about how the Oilers, it has to be their year. And I was like, you can't underestimate the Panthers. Oh, but the Oilers have this and that and their skill. But the Panthers are a really tough team to play against. And this is the thing that, like, we always talk about is that, you know, you get people saying, oh, skill and soft and all of that. You have to be tough. We're not saying you don't have to be tough. That is a requirement if you're going to go far in the NHL, particularly in a long run. But it can't just be tough. That toughness has to either come with skill in one player or balanced across your lineup with skill. And the Florida Panthers have done such an amazing job of that. I think they're the class and the team to beat currently, but I don't necessarily think that they're going to be top of the division this year just because they're tired. They played like till the Stanley Cup final 2 years in a row. They're probably tired. I don't like they'll for sure make the playoffs. Don't know if they'll be top of the division. I don't know how far they'll go in the playoffs, but you can't count them out, right? Like, to me, they're the only one where I could say 100% that they're going to go at least 2 rounds in the playoffs.
Yeah, I completely agree with you with that. I do wonder, too, like that hangover they call, right? The Stanley Cup final hangover 2 years in a row. I do wonder how much of an effect that's going to have because you've seen teams like the Tampa Bay Lightning make 3 straight Cup finals. Like, It is definitely a factor. Like, they'll get off to slow starts, but a lot of these premier teams, they find their footing really fast. And like you said, they might not finish top of the division, but by April, May, they might just have found their groove again and be good enough to make a pretty deep playoff run. I mean, from there, right, like, we go, second place in the division, the Boston Bruins. I mean, I think, like, the next 2, Boston and Toronto, Laura, pretty easy to discuss why we hate these teams.
100%. One of the biggest reasons, Brian, that I hate the Boston Bruins is that I've been predicting for the longest time that they're going to be on the outs, you know, like
everyone else
every year. You know, not even just like not make the playoffs. Like, they're going to be at the bottom of the division. When is that going to happen? I've been predicting it so many years in a row, pretty much since, you know, when did they lose to the Blues? That year. And it's still not happening. And then you see them lose their key players, right? Like, they're you know, Zdeno Chara's, Patrice Bergeron, and they still find a way to kind of put it together. You know, you looked at it 2 years ago and you're like, this team, like, who are their defensemen? Have you even heard of any of these guys? And then they go and they, like, you know, go to the top of the standings. Like, it's really, really tough for to predict with Boston, but it's also like that's the team I hate the most in the NHL. Like no questions asked, and Toronto will never come close. And it just they keep making the playoffs, they keep having success, and it's driving me nuts.
Yeah, I mean it's the same thing with me that it is with you. Like last 4 years, I predicted them to finally slip in the standings, and yet last year they finished second in the division with 109. Like I understand too, like they had incredible goaltending the last few years, and I do think that losing one of those like this is a huge year for Jeremy Swayman if they ever actually get him signed. That like he will have to be the guy. Before, he could split the workload with Linus Ullmark. But being the guy, that workload, I mean, that's going to be an extra, 20 games to his. He's never played that many games in an NHL regular season. So I wonder if he's going to prove up to the task, right? Like losing Linus Ullmark, that's even if he is, right? Like just by losing Linus Ullmark, that's a huge loss. And they made a couple big signings this past offseason. I think they way overpaid for the two guys because they're trying to address center needs. They have no center depth, and that's one of the biggest positions. And I would say next to goaltending, center depth is the most important thing you have to have in the league because the center is involved in everything on the ice. And they have no true number one center. Like they have a collection of 2 and 3 Cs. And so they overpaid in the offseason to try to address that for guys who are still 2 and 3 Cs. So I want to again be like, this is the year they fall off, but past experiences have me a little cautious on that. But I could see them in the wild card conversation. I mean, because they still have Marchand and Pasternak. Like in the end of the day, those two guys can take over games, but I'm just looking at the rest of the roster. I'm like, this isn't the Boston that dominated for years, and yet they'll still end up with 103 points or something.
Yeah. And it'll be really annoying for everybody. All right, Toronto. Do you want this one or shall I take it?
It's obvious, right? Like, it's just, I don't like Toronto because they're Toronto. They are the media darling. They're the Yankees of the NHL. They're the Cowboys of the NHL. The media loves to talk about every year. Huh?
With fewer wins.
With fewer wins. Every year, the NHL likes to talk about how this is the Leafs' year, and albeit it should be. Right. And it's almost like I don't ever want the Leafs to win another Stanley Cup again because Toronto-Detroit rivalry is a great thing. And it's hilarious that they haven't won since 1967. But at the same time, I understand Toronto Maple Leafs fans' frustrations when you have guys like Matthews, Nylander, Marner, Morgan Rielly, all these guys on this team who are 40 goal scorers or number one defensemen, and yet they can't figure it out. I understand the frustration. But do I kind of, like their frustration? Enjoy it? Yeah, probably. Just because it's the Maple Leafs, man. Yeah. What else you got to say?
And it's the thing that's really funny is that, the last, I don't know how many years, they've been doing it to themselves. They're tripping over their own selves, and it's incredible. And I just, the Mitch Marner narratives, the one thing that I want from this world is for them to either trade him or not re-sign him. And then he goes to another team, and then he immediately wins the Stanley Cup. It would be so funny.
I think Kyle Dubas put them in a really bad spot with those contracts he signed them to. They have 2 guys who make over 12, one guy who makes over 11, and another guy who's just shy of 11. That is, and granted, these are some of the best players in the league. I won't deny that. But for each and every one of those guys to make that much money, you look at what the Detroit Red Wings just did, and I'm not trying to say Matthews and Larkin are on the same tier. I'm not that naive. I'm not that biased. But they signed Larkin at 8.5. And then they signed Larkin at 8.7, Seider at 8.5, then Raymond at 8. That's a good cap management of your core pieces and your star players.
Yeah.
Signing Tavares and then having to go out and pay Matthews the next year because you just signed Tavares to that exorbitant contract, that's not good cap management.
He did not live up to. He did not live up to that. And that's the thing too. It's
Tavares,
Montreal did the exact same thing. Yeah, Tavares, not Matthews. Matthews is fine. The Canadiens did the same thing, right? They signed Nick Suzuki, and that was the standard. Cole Caulfield took a little less, and when they acquired Patrik Laine, he got asked, this is the one guy on the team that makes more than Nick Suzuki. And Kent Hughes was like, I didn't negotiate that contract. I took it on. Right. So that's the standard. Nick Suzuki currently is the most important player on this team. Nobody makes more than him. Right. And that's, to me, that's understandable. If ever the Canadiens were to acquire a center that is of a higher caliber than Nick Suzuki, which I fully agree is out there, right? Like we just talked about 2 centers that you would put maybe a little bit above him, or in Matthews' case, a lot above him, right? But they're still sending a message, right? Like if you want to be part of this team, it's not about you, it's about the collective goal. And Cole Caulfield happily took less. Uri Slafkovsky happily took less, right? It's like that's the way it is. And so when you are signing people to those contracts, and that's why I was like, what are you doing, not Red Wings, sorry, Edmonton Oilers, with the Draisaitl contract? It's like, I'm all for players getting paid. I'm all for, like the union and et cetera, et cetera. But like, if you're the one team doing this, when you have another player that's worth more that you need to re-sign, like that to me is like, you are not messing up the market. You're messing up the market for everybody, but you're also mostly screwing yourselves over. So with Toronto, I think that was the biggest thing. I want to get into Tampa Bay because I'm really hoping that this is the year they're just outside the playoff picture.
Me too. I would really love for any one of these teams to actually like tank. And losing Stamkos and Sergachev is a massive blow. But to their credit, they did a nice job, reacquiring McDonough, who had a really nice bounce back year with Nashville. And then signing Jake Gensel was huge. While I don't think Jake Gensel is going to 100% replace Steven Stamkos, him being a younger player will help fill in some of those gaps. And he is still a 40-goal scorer. It's really hard, especially when they still have Kucherov. They still have Braden Point, who's in his prime. They still have Vasilevsky, who's, by the way, not even 30 yet. That blew my mind last year. I feel like he's been in the league for like 20 years. Vasilevsky's still in his prime. Like, I want to say that their window is closing, and I do think it's trending in that direction. But when you have a collection of these players who are still all playing at a high level, you couldn't... Hedman, yeah. Like, you can still survive losing a Stamkos or losing a Sergachev and make the playoffs. Will they be division winners? I don't think so. But will they be in the wild card? I think that they're very much in that conversation. I don't think you can argue that.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, who's next? Probably let's do Buffalo because Buffalo's easy. I think, if all of their players with potential actually hit that potential, I do think that they're going to be in that wild card conversation, but there's something about them that always reliably disappoints.
Yeah. I to be honest, I don't even dislike the Sabres. I mean, the only reason I dislike them is just because they're competing for a wild card with my Detroit Red Wings. But they're a team that if I wasn't in this division, I would find it very easy to root for. I mean, This is a long-suffering fan base, right? Longest drought in the NHL right now for making the playoffs. They have an extremely fun, young core. Owen Power, Rasmus Dahlin. Tage Thompson's not super young. I know they acquired him, but he blossomed late. He was a late bloomer. UPL and Net now, who blossomed last season. They have young, fun players, but the big problem with them continues to be the same problem: is can they get better defensively? And I all last season, I kept saying the Red Wings were the Buffalo Sabres, or trending to be the Buffalo Sabres of 2 years ago, where they outscored their problems and they were scoring at a faster rate than they were allowing goals, but they were allowing a lot of goals. And the Red Wings, same way, seasons ended almost the same way, right? Sabres 2 years ago missed the playoffs by a point. Red Wings missed the playoffs by a point on a tiebreaker. So, the only way I see the Sabres taking the step forward is if Lindy Ruff comes in and establishes a system that emphasizes defense, because the offense is there. But if they don't play reliable defense, then I don't see how their end result changes.
Absolutely. I'm in full agreement with you on that one. And then finally, Ottawa, which is a team that I love to disdain.
Okay, good.
I feel like Ottawa's been they had a 5-year rebuild that ended 5 years ago and they're still in it a little bit. I am a little bit annoyed that they got better in terms of in goal. But, a couple of years ago, they acquired better forwards. A couple of years ago, last year was it, they acquired better defense. And then, DeBrincat was like, I'm not staying here. And so I feel like with Ottawa, I can't figure out what their problem is, because they should be better than they are.
Yes, I agree. I think their problem last few seasons, I mean, I talking to the Locked On Sens guys, they're pretty adamant. They just always get off to a really bad start, and that tanks you can't win a Stanley Cup in October, but you can certainly lose one. And that's the big problem. They don't find their groove reliably until November, it sounds like. And up until this year, and, Linus Ullmark has a track record with Buffalo before Boston of being a very good goalie. So he's not like a systems goalie. So I believe Linus Ullmark will really help them. But in years previous, goaltending has been a huge issue. And then again, a lot like the Red Wings, like they don't play good team defense. A lot like the Sabres, they didn't play good team defense. So like they have a collection of really, really, you're noticing a trend here with these teams that are always so close but don't make it, right? They have a collection of just guys like, I get tired of hearing it every year, and I say it every year myself, so I'm also part of the problem. Like, this is the year the Senators make the playoffs. As much as I disdain them, like, unbiasedly, pragmatically looking at their Tim Stutzle has had a 90-point season. Brady Tkachuk's, I strongly dislike playing against any Tkachuk, but he's a very good player. Claude Giroux's still good. Josh Norris is good. They got Jake Sanderson, who's a number 1 D-man. Like, they have a roster that is playoff caliber, but every year they find a way to blow it. And I think addressing Linus Ullmark is a huge step in the right direction. I think getting a new owner is a huge step in the right direction, getting a new general manager. Like, that's the thing. Like, I think really what was holding them back the last few years is not on the ice, but behind the bench and in the front office. Those were what was holding them back for the longest time.
And I think there's something about like an attitude and identity that permeates from the front office onto the ice. The coaching staff you use needs to be the right talent. They need to understand how to reach players. And so I understand, like, with them, like, we could see them take a step forward this year, but it's really hard to envision which out of the 4 teams that made the playoffs last year get out. But they're still the wild card in the Metropolitan Division, which, let's be honest, the Metropolitan Division has taken a step back. So to end this show, Brian, who do you think makes the playoffs first, the Montreal Canadiens or the Detroit Red Wings?
Oh, I mean, I think the Red Wings right now are the closer team. Long term, I think your Canadiens are going to be a real pain in the butt. But I think right now, as it stands, the Red Wings are a more proven team, and they're just a little further ahead in their rebuild. They're going to have another one of their former first-round picks crack the lineup this year, and then you have guys like Danielson and Kasper, who are other first-round picks, threatening to make the roster as well. Sebastian Cossa, I predict next year, probably cracks, and then they'll have their goalie prospect up at the NHL level. So, I mean, I think the Red Wings, with their collection of talent that's proven at the NHL level, and as well as still having a very deep prospect pool that's not there yet, I think that they're closer at right now and still have a very promising future to get even better with players under team control. But that's not to say that the Canadiens are like that far behind. Like I said earlier, the Canadiens rebuild has been going very fast. It's actually been quite impressive how they've gotten so much better the last couple seasons from bottoming out. Like, it's honestly incredible.
And I think that's the key thing too, is that you just talked about how there's still so many prospects that haven't made it. Like, they still have a deep prospect pool, because you could always go the Toronto route and blow it all, and not draft really well and not have anything in the cupboards to kind of replace your talent with, which I think the Canadiens are desperately trying to avoid with accumulating as many draft picks as they have and drafting in the way that they are. Like, there are some guys that like have potential but might be further away. So I think it's a really optimistic time, but I do agree with you, Brian, and I do hope that it is this year for Detroit, because the chances are that if Detroit makes it in, then Ottawa still doesn't make it in. So that's my big hope. Brian, please tell the listeners where they can find you and your work.
Well, you can find me on X at Brian Fisher, LORW. You can find the Locked On Red Wings podcast account at LO_Red Wings. And then, of course, we're on YouTube and all that. Oh, shout out Scotty, my co-host at Bentley Scotty as well. He's also the host of Locked On Tigers. So if you like Tigers baseball, he is the go-to guy for that. He is hilarious to follow on social media, honest to God. He's so good at I can't say the word, but expletive posting.
We call it Scott posting, actually. So like we
Really?
have Scott, right? So we call it Scott posting, so it works, because I used to always call him Scotty to distinguish him from my Scott, but now I have an Ian, so Scott Bentley, definitely worth a follow. And as for us, you can find us wherever you get your podcasts, as well as on YouTube. Please follow us on Twitter, LO_Canadiens. We are on Instagram at Locked On Canadiens. I am at The Active Stick. My wonderful co-host is at Maybe It's Ian. We will be back tomorrow with some preseason action. Thank you so much for listening, and we will see you tomorrow.